On now to elementary Greek II in the infinitive. So proud of your work. Thus far, we have looked at the indicatives and participles, the subjunctive, and now the infinitive, verbal nouns. I want to pray and ask God's blessing on your work this week and walk through the ideas of the infinitive here in Mounts. Pray with me. Lord, strengthen students this week, give them encouragement. I pray that you'll build them up, give them time and margin to study not just Greek, but your word, to have their Bibles open and following along in Greek as best they can, and with greater efficiency every week, gathering these ideas of Greek and of your word and connecting the dots, even looking toward exegesis. I pray that you would provide opportunities for them to continue to study, to learn, and to take in your word. Help them now to understand verbal nouns, to remember these endings and the paradigm that we are going to learn here in chapter 32 and the nuances. I ask this in Christ's name. Amen. So the infinitive, verbal nouns. When we think about verbal nouns, we are thinking about verbs that are not finite. The distinction between infinitives and the finite verb is that the finite verb is limited. It's finite as opposed to infinitive. You think of Buzz Lightyear, to infinity and beyond. There's no limit. Well, there's no limit by person or number of a subject. If you remember, in the indicative verbs and in the subjunctives, we have first, second, third person, singular or plural. We have the person and number limiting the verb. That particular verb is limited to a specific person and number. First, second, third person, and then singular or plural. Infinitives are not limited in that way. Yet sometimes we'll see the accusative does function, oddly enough, as the subject of the infinitive. Normally we think of the subject of a verb being, yes, the nominative, but here the accusative with the infinitive often figures as the subject. The idea of aspect yet holds sway over time, just as in the subjunctive. The present, continuous aspect, aorist, undefined, perfect, a completed, or a stative aspect. So the present, we think of continue in some way, and the perfect with a have verb, and the aorist just the simple statement. Here's the morpheme chart, and this just has to be memorized. It's one of those, and we'll see with the imperative here coming up that these paradigms just have to be memorized. So in the present, ain, esthai, psi, sosthai, theai. Second aorist, ain, esthai, ani. Perfect, nai, sthai, thigh. Let's pause for a moment here. The present active ain, that is actually a contraction of an epsilon connecting vowel with the true infinitive morpheme epsilon nu. So we have that epsilon epsilon together. If we remember contract patterns, it leads to epsilon iota, and that's what we have here. In the second aorist, that psi ending, the iota is actually the ending. The sa is the tense formative typical of aorist. And that will play a part here in just a few moments. We'll notice some contraction patterns. One other note, look at the present active and second aorist active. Yes, they're exactly the same. How would you tell the difference? That's right, the stem. First aorist passive, that tense formative, always playing a helpful role for us in identifying and parsing. Theta, eta, and then the second aorist passive, just the eta. If we look at translation then, luane, too loose, luesthai in the present there, too loose. As Mounts notes, translation of a single infinitive is extremely hard because the infinitive is so dependent upon context, and we're just sort of coming close with a general gloss or translation here. The most basic nuance of translating an infinitive is if it's passive, and you can see that here, to be loosed as opposed to loose, or to loose for oneself in the middle, passive to be loosed. And look at the translation of the present and first aorist. Exactly the same, and the second aorist as well, just a basic kind of translation, but the passive to be, the perfect to have loosed, to have loosed, to have been loosed, and you can see the passivity there. There are a few nuances in how infinitives are formed, and I have 3 slides here. This is slide A of 3, so we'll have A, B, and C of nuances of the infinitives and recognize them. And we begin with the liquid first aorist. You can see the appendices in Mounts, and specifically page 381 for this, and you can also look at other references here that I put. If you look back to the liquid aorist in the indicative chapter, that will help you as well, just thinking about those, the liquids. So here they are in review. Lambda, mu, nu, and rho. These characters, if they end a stem, these are liquid aorists. And those characters bump up against the first aorist active infinitive tense form of sigma, just as they did previously in the indicative. And there's an epsilon that's included before the sigma. An epsilon comes before lambda, mu, nu, or rho, before the sigma and the aorist, and that causes that sigma to, yes, drop out. It's an intervocalic sigma, it drops out, and we begin to have some contraction patterns. The tense formative loses the sigma, so you're left with just an alpha in that consonant. The first aorist active infinitive tense morpheme is actually just the iota, as I mentioned earlier. And so what we'll have here is that iota standing by with the alpha and the nu or mu here, or the nu or rho, as our ending. The good news, the lambda and mu stems occur as infinitives in the first aorist New Testament. They're absent, but stems ending in nu or rho, they occur regularly. So nigh is a first aorist ending. If we go back a slide or 2 here, look at that first aorist active. It's psi, but it becomes nigh when that sigma drops out, and we are left with just the stem and the alpha iota ending. Apokteni, krini, meni. So stems that end in a liquid nu, that sigma in the first aorist is going to drop out, and we have just nigh. Same those that end in a rho. Ageri, for instance. Ari, to take up. Is that clear? Going to jump back again. Psi becomes nigh or ri because that sigma drops out. So if you see nigh or ri, the key is just the last 2 letters there, that alpha iota, and an aorist stem. But not all liquid aorists are first aorists, as in the second aorist liquid ballane. But you can see how nicely it does fit into the second aorist active ending, epsilon iota nu. And how do we distinguish it from the present? Yes, that present is extended. You see the double lambda with the present, and the aorist just the single lambda. So liquids, when we have a liquid, the first aorist sigma is going to drop out, so we don't have psi, we will have that liquid consonant and then alpha iota. And in the New Testament, just nu and rho. There are no lambda or mu ending liquid first aorist infinitives. Next nuance, me verbs. We'll cover these shortly, but these have similar nigh endings, but for different reasons. Me verbs do not take a connecting vowel and thus use nigh as the actual tense formatives. Ani must be remembered. It occurs many times in the New Testament. Translated to be, it's from a me. It's translated to be, and you can think of the number of ideas that would follow that. To be this or to be that. And didonai, present active infinitive. We're used to seeing ain, but me verbs will not take that epsilon iota nu in the present active. They will actually look like which tense stem? They look like perfects. See the nigh there? But they are actually present. And you'll be able to recognize those because there's no reduplication. But just recognize that the present active stem, or morpheme rather, ain, can look like nigh with me verbs, verbs that end in me, mu iota, like ame and didomi. Third nuance of infinitives, contract verbs. If we have a verb that stem ends in alpha, epsilon, or omicron, remember those are our contract verbs. I had a whole chapter on those in the indicatives. And here we are looking at the contract patterns when that stem vowel comes into contact with the infinitive morpheme. So for instance, agapa plus ain, look at what happens. Epsilon drops out. Remember, epsilon is a weak vowel. It drops out, and we have alpha iota nu. Normally, in that kind of a pattern, the iota will do what? Yes, it will subscript. But here it becomes a circumflex, and we have agapon. And you'll see this here in exercise 32 in parsing number 8. Agapon. If you don't recognize that behind agapon is actually agapain, and it's present active infinitive, you'll be confused. So alpha contracts will look like alpha nu there ending in the infinitive. So we go from ain to on. Perhaps one clue is just to focus on the last letter. Epsilon contracts. Epsilon epsilon equals epsilon iota. And what we can see here, poiesthai. The contraction pattern would be the same with ain, poiein. So that epsilon epsilon equals epsilon iota. Omicron contracts, omicron plus epsilon. That's right, oo, and here again with omicron contracts, instead of that iota being a subscript in some way, here it just becomes a circumflex, and we have plerun. And again, we have the similar ending, just the nu, like agapon, and the previous vowel has a circumflex over it. You'll just have to remember those patterns, the contract verbs. Translating the infinitive. There are three different ideas here that we're going to cover. First, the substantive, where the infinitive functions like a noun. And you can see it here in Philippians 1:21. Emoigar ta zein Christos, kai ta apathanen kerdos. To live is Christ, to die is gain. Here, ta zein, that ta, remember, can be nominative or accusative in its form. Here it is, yes, it's nominative. It's functioning as the subject, and there's a verb of being supplied. To live is Christ. To die is gain. Same with ta apathane. So these are substantive infinitives. Most infinitives are complementary. They complete the meaning of a finite verb. Verbs like necessity, ability, volition. It is necessary or must. I would wish or would like to. I am about to. I am able to. It is lawful to blank. I am beginning to, I desire to, and therefore this infinitive will complete these verbs. So these are indicative verbs: de, melo, dunamai, existin, archemai, thelo. Those are infinitives, or rather indicatives, and an infinitive will follow and complement. Sometimes an infinitive will have a preposition and an article, and that will indicate a specific nuance, and these are significant for exegesis. Diata communicates a cause for that action in the infinitive. Aista and prosta both communicate purpose, in order that. The infinitive often codes time, and when we have pro to, we translate the infinitive with a keyword before. En to, and always with the dative, while or during. And metata is a subsequent idea, after. And then the result, choste. That's the infinitive. Keep reviewing vocab and pressing on here. Proud of your work.